So I will make a start. It's brilliant to be here with you all today. So hopefully you can see that and you can hear me. And yeah, I'm going to take you through some findings from some recent research we did, where we took the time to have a bit of a deep dive into the experiences and what we know about the numbers of children in care and care leavers with a disability or a long-term health condition. And I guess our starting point was this question. So maybe we think this question's really simple to answer. So how many children in care and care leavers have a disability or long-term health condition? Well, actually, it's really difficult to answer this question because the national statistics from the Department for Education don't contain information on this. They don't publish the numbers. And once we start looking into it, what seems maybe a simple question actually becomes more complicated. But it's a really fundamental question because if we're not counting our children in care and care leavers with a disability, how do we know if the services we're providing are meeting their needs? So I'll take you through what we've done, and I'm really pleased to be with you here today and have that bit of space to reflect together on how the findings link to the roles that you all do. So as I said, having good quality data helps us understand the needs of these children. Today, we're going to look at what we know and, importantly, what we don't know about these children's experiences, with some time to think together about, well, what does disability mean to children, young people and professionals? What are the numbers and what are the experiences? And I'm sharing some findings from a Freedom of Information request, some workshops we did with young people and leaving care professionals, and also findings from the Bright Spots programme, as well as our advocacy services. So defining disability, it's not simple. It includes impairments, but also that wider effects from social, cultural and physical environments. So we found that there could be similarities in the challenges highlighted by young people and professionals, but also when we dug into what they were saying, we found, different services and different people from those different services talk about disability in varied ways. So some might have more of a focus, so they might lean in more to the medical model. So what's wrong with a person? How do we fix it? Whereas others are coming maybe more from a social model. How do the attitudes and the barriers around disabled people, what can we do about that? So if we look at the law, the Equality Act defines disability if you have a physical or mental impairment that's got a substantial and long-term negative effect. And you can see here the different strands that links to in terms of different types of disability. I'll just pop back to that one. Okay, so things like sensory impairments that fluctuate, because disability can be fluid, can occur at different points in time. It can look quite different. You've got developmental impairments, learning disabilities, mental health conditions. So we wanted to start with, well, what does disability mean to you? I don't think we have these conversations a lot. And we started with care experienced young people holding a workshop because, to be child-centred, we need to understand where young people are coming from. And they were really insightful in the sort of things they shared with us. So they said disability can include loads of things like neurodiversity. Some can be hidden, some can be visible. Maybe everyone's got some kind of different needs. They thought that getting help with disability could be difficult, that it felt like you were passed around to different people. Sometimes it could be good to have a diagnosis, but sometimes that could feel stigmatizing, or there might be misdiagnosis. So we learned a lot from our care experienced young people. And then when we spent a bit of time with professionals, we did a workshop with over 100 professionals who work with care leavers, asking, what does disability mean to you and to your service? Again, they came back with conversations grappling with defining disability. So They thought some disabilities were much more clear-cut and easy to define. So sometimes maybe work tended to focus on physical impairments or learning impairments where it may seem more obvious the need. Some they felt like young people, echoing what they'd said, they felt that things were not always visible. And people were really honest with us and said, you know, we don't always feel comfortable and confident talking about things such as neurodiversity. There was conversations about the intersection of trauma and disability, and whether a label or a diagnosis doesn't actually tell you very much. And again, that sort of variation depending on who's defining. Professionals also, as I said, shared that they felt sometimes there was a lack of information and knowledge. So it wasn't necessarily something they felt was a specialism in leaving care. There was those gaps in knowledge. And we'll come on to this. There was sort of really limited data and information. And at the heart of it, they said, you know, sometimes I'm not sure we always ask young people directly their views about disability or long-term health impairments and how that may or may not be impacting on their life. One person saying, I've got no idea where in our records we could pull the disability data if we were asked. We just don't have a good understanding of neurodiversity or how our services need to be shaped for young people to thrive. And again, when we're talking to professionals, you know, they're really reflecting their unhappiness with the support they can get their hands on and the sort of joined upness of how things are currently working. So people sharing, look, you know, there can be quite a disconnect between children's adult services. Eligibility can feel unclear. It can feel fluid. Some care experienced children could be accepted and others not. And interesting, echoing what young people had said, you know, it can feel like quite a fight getting the right support for your young person as they're growing up in care and becoming care leavers. So, you know, people talking about not young people in terms of service eligibility being not disabled enough. And that really we wanted to see things flexing more, wanted to see things improving inclusivity. So I think it is, as I said right at the beginning, really important that we know about the numbers of disabled children and care leavers. So we need to know who they are. And the absence of accurate information impacts on how we develop our services, how we monitor what we're doing, whether we're effectively meeting them. And as I said, it's really interesting that there's no national data published about this. So we sent this freedom of information request to all of the English local authorities to address that gap in our knowledge. So let's see what we found out. Firstly, we got a good response rate. So we heard from about 133 local authorities, and they were telling us about over 76,000 children in care and 55,000 care leavers. So that's a robust response rate. And in that FOI, we asked them, tell us, what do you record on your management systems in terms of the number of children in care, the number of care leavers, and also the information you record about the type of disability. And the reason we knew local authorities should be able to easily tell us this is because the Children in Need Census instructs local authorities to collect information on type of disability. So we knew they should be doing this. And so here we can see our findings. So based on what is recorded on the systems in those local authorities, we can say for the first time, because we hadn't this information published, 11% of children in care are recorded as having a disability and 13% of care leavers. And if we were to compare that to the general population, I think it's quite interesting. It's the same proportion for children in care. So in the general population, the figures are 11% of children have a disability. That maps across. And it's quite interesting that for care leavers, the proportion in the general population is higher than the proportion. So bear that in mind. I think that's quite a counterintuitive findings, quite interesting. And the local authorities, one of the big findings was the amount of variation. So look at this. In relation to children in care, in some local authorities, it was as low as 3% recorded having a disability, right up to about a third, up to 32%. And you can see a similar amount of variation. So something's going on there as well in these recording systems. And you'll remember I mentioned that we can ask the local authorities to tell us about type of disability, because that is in the Children in Need census. So these are the categories from government, and the largest group across children in care and care leavers were learning, behaviour and autism. So they were the most commonly recorded types. For those who were recorded, yes, this child is disabled, this was the most common. And you could have multiple disabilities. So of course, some children, the recording was across those. So I would like to just position the findings when we actually ask care leavers directly, do they have a disability? And tell you that we find a big disparity in the numbers. So when you ask care leavers directly, and we've done this through our Bright Spots surveys, and we've got about 8,000 responses from 83 local authorities, 83 surveys across 48 local authorities, you've got 27% of care leavers themselves saying, yes, I've got a disability or long-term health condition. And that proportion has been going up over the years. So when we started asking that question back in 2017, about a fifth, 22%, and our latest figures show about a third. So that, I think that's an important finding to bear in mind as well. And what I like about this graphic is it just shows those different proportions, that different prevalence, depending on the source of information. So 13% for care leavers on the local authority systems, 15.6% in the general population, but ask young adults leaving care themselves, and you've got about 27%, the average. And what we've done with the Bright Spots survey is introduce a follow-up question to unpick this a little bit more. So if you want to, if you've indicated yes, I have a disability through that anonymous survey, then please tell us more if you would like to. And then in the word cloud, that represents the more common things that young people talked about. So it was really rare that a care leaver would write just one disability. They were often talking about autism, and they were often talking about mental health problems, which is not one of the codes that is in the government Children in Need census categories. So now I just want to spend a little bit of time listening to Susan, who's a care experience colleague who I've been working with on this report, and she wrote a blog for us. So we're just going to listen to what Susan has to say about her experience as a disabled child growing up in care.
Growing up in care with multiple disabilities was extremely challenging. I did not speak or smile at age 2 and was described as depressed by my family social worker. At 4, another social worker queried whether I might have autism, but girls don't have that, was claimed. When I was 11, my older brother was diagnosed with autism, and when I read the paperwork, it summed me up. I knew then I was autistic. I also have a condition called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which causes mobility issues, and something as simple as picking up my school bag could lead to a dislocated shoulder and land me in A&E. At 12, I suffered a traumatic brain injury. I fell off a friend's shoulders, breaking my skull, and cerebellar ataxia followed. Whilst I relearnt to walk with crutches for a short period, I'm now a full-time wheelchair user with a visual impairment. I went into care at 14. I was always going to be vulnerable due to my brain injury, but this was not always taken seriously by the professionals at my residential care home. To help me recover from my fear of sitting on other people's shoulders, one of the staff sat me on his shoulders in a local park. I fell backwards and hit my head in a different area from my previous break. Whilst in the residential care home, I was diagnosed with mixed anxiety and depressive disorder, anorexia and CPTSD, but I was never supported to understand what my needs were and how they might impact my life. I finally asked to be assessed for autism. It had been picked up by multiple professionals, including the manager of the children's home and some teachers at the new school. However, CAMHS refused to assess me. They said that because I was in care, I could be moved at any point on the waiting list and couldn't guarantee I would still be living in the same area. CAMHS said I would have to wait until I was 18 to be put on the adult waiting list. My social worker should have fought for me at that point, but nothing happened. At 16, I broke down. I had an anorexia relapse and was having daily episodes, which I now know to be autistic meltdowns. The residential home placed me on a behaviour plan which stated if I had more than 2 episodes a week, I failed. If I had more than 4 failures in 3 months, I would lose my place at the residential home. Well, I lost my place. I felt that the care system couldn't handle my disabilities. I was then moved to a homeless YMCA hostel that also failed to manage my disabilities. I needed to use the lift, but it was only in operation after 8 a.m, when I needed to leave the hostel at 7:30 a.m. to get to school on time. As a consequence, I was late for school every day and I was kicked out of the hostel within 26 days. Without support, I went on to fail all but 2 of my GCSEs and all of my A-levels. I finally received a late diagnosis of autism at the age of 21 and went on to do an Access to Higher Education course to get into university to study international relations and politics. Thanks to the diagnosis, I now receive a specialist support from an autism-trained mentor twice a week, which helps me stay on track with my studies. Sadly, my story as a young person with disabilities, struggling to access diagnosis and support in the care system, is far from unique.
Great. Brilliant. And we'll return to Susan's recommendations towards the end of the presentation. So there's really very limited research. So we've seen that the data in this area is lacking and difficult. And the research that is available is quite scarce. So I'll take you through some of the areas that we do know from the evidence we have. But I just want to highlight it's an area where we don't have a lot of attention. But whatever way disability is measured and recorded, we are really talking about a large proportion of children and care leavers affected. But we sort of know very little about how they're doing. So the existing research talks and shows us that children and young people generally with a disability are at an increased risk of experience abuse compared to children without disability. And children with disabilities may be more likely to be looked after than non-disabled children. Children, when they do come into care, those with a disability, can have quite different pathways through care, so quite different experiences. So they may be more likely than other children in care to live in residential homes, more likely to live at distance, so to live out of area. They might be more likely, if they are to be adopted, to wait longer. If they're going home, they might be less likely to go home. And if they do, that takes longer. And again, they might be more likely to experience multiple moves and live in placements that don't meet their needs and are inappropriate. We've got all the references for this research at the end, so you can look up. And as a result, disabled children in care are likely to stay in care for longer and then likely to become care leavers. And as we were saying, whilst they were in care, they might not be supported to stay connected to the people who are important to them. So there's some evidence that they experienced lower levels of contact. And also some worrying evidence that children and young people in care who are disabled, their views and perspectives might not always be routinely collected and sought. And in relation to children as they grow older and maybe start to leave care, there's a lot of concern around young people who have what may be called kind of borderline impairments. So those young people who fall through gaps, who don't meet the criteria for some of the services. Evidence around limited options and choice in relation to employment and housing. I'm just going to show you this graphic that we had produced. So the Bright Spots programme, which is the anonymous survey, the subjective wellbeing survey, where we have over 8,000 responses. We looked at a section of these responses and we compared care leavers who reported disability, say, yes, I have a disability or long-term health, and we compared them to all other care leavers on all of these measures. Those with a disability or long-term health problem are reporting lower levels of well-being. So those with a disability more likely to not feel safe in their home, not feel settled, more likely to be finding it difficult to cope financially, less likely to feel involved in pathway planning, have a good friend, to report loneliness, and like I said, report a larger proportion having low well-being. So I think some really concerning findings from the evidence we do have about how these young people are getting on. And we were also able to look at kind of practice evidence. So CoramVoice run an advocacy service. We have a specialist disability advocate service, and some of the issues that we see through that area, we see a lot of challenges. So we see kind of rights-based issues, so a lack of recognition that disabled adults are entitled to care leaver support, disputes about capacity, failure to work together, wrangles about funding, non-person centered approaches, so sometimes care experienced young people not being listened to, and also a lack of planning or drift in the plans. So in the full report, you'll be able to read more about some of these practice issues that were coming up. The specialist disability advocate support is available freely for anyone, young people and also professionals who support children and young people. There is free training around transition planning, training around meaningful communication. There's a transition toolkit, what an ideal transition would look like. And there's also on the website a FAQ, and there's a form you can fill in if you would like some advice around a specific young person. So we're just going to hear a really short film from one of the specialist advocates.
Hi, I'm Emma. I'm a specialist advocate for young people with disabilities at CoramVoice. I have an amazing job which includes working with young people in care and care leavers who have disabilities, and I also help other advocates to do that job. So when people are making decisions about your life, it's really important that they listen to what you want. So an advocate can try to make sure that people are listening, and they can also tell you about your rights. So that includes what support you should be getting from your social worker or your personal advisor. An advocate can do things like helping you to speak up at meetings or helping you to write complaints. So I just want you to know that if you feel you're not being listened to, if you feel you're not being treated fairly, then help is out there. Disabled young people have as many rights as all other young people in the care system. Plus, every disabled person's different, so you can ask for different or extra support to meet your needs. If you feel like an advocate could help you, then please do contact CoramVoice or your local advocacy service.
Great. And I'll just go back here and I'm going to share some of the recommendations. So the full report has 19 recommendations for government. So there's things in there. We're talking to the Department for Education, to their data team. They collect this information. They don't publish this information. So there's some remedies there that they could work on. They could also work on improving the categories, the disability codes, working with young people and practitioners about collecting a data set that would be more helpful. So we're having those conversations. So our recommendations are, there's data that you've got, use it better, use it to inform. If you don't know where it is, so we're asking people to sort of spend some time exploring what they do collect and then looking to how could they, with their young people, improve what they collect. And then there's some recommendations about listening and responding to how young people are doing and building that more into our services. Supporting our colleagues with their confidence, skills, learning from each other, improving the services that we actually already have, and then addressing the gaps in the services. So do take a look at the full set of recommendations, but today I've just pulled out the recommendations for local authorities. Like I said, there's things around reviewing the data, recording what young people self-report as well, and not just recording it for recording's sake, but, you know, action, no voice without action. So following through, making sure young people and practitioners are aware of access to advocacy and that the opportunities are accessible. You know, so we have a lot of youth groups and opportunities for young people to influence service improvement. Are those opportunities always as accessible as they could be? How can we support practitioners and professionals? What are the training gaps? You know, can we start having some honest conversations about how we all view disability, where we're coming from, what our ethos is as a team, and then recommendations about improving those referral pathways and addressing some of those really obvious gaps that we see. So young people were really clear they want to have meaningful conversations with people who know them about long-term health and disability and how this can inform life day to day. So being more curious. If there is a diagnosis on file, what does it mean? Yeah, so creating those more supportive and inclusive environments. And so I just wanted to finish with the last word from Susan and her recommendations. It's been great working alongside Care Experience colleagues to try to get the message out there. This focus in this report, I think, is needed. As I said, there's limited data, there's limited information out there. So Susan would like to see dedicated neurodiversity workers in looked after children's team. She thinks speech and language therapists who have got the skills around autism, ADHD and other common disabilities. So, you know, are we connecting with our colleagues in other parts of children's social care? Social workers, like bolstering their support, making sure they've got the up-to-date data they need, and encouraging, are they having those conversations? She also talks about professionals being supported by their LAs, and she'd really welcome children when they come into care and services think that there's disability, additional needs. Is there options to fast track to services such as CAMS, so don't fall through the gaps like she did? And she ends by saying, I struggled as a child in care with disabilities, but after receiving the diagnosis I needed and the necessary support, I've excelled in higher education. I'm now applying to study for a PhD. Now is the time to ensure the next generation of looked after children and care leavers are given the right support to reach their potential. Great. So I'm going to finish there.